He glanced at her name tag. Iris. He turned to his cynical lieutenants, a cruel smirk playing across his face. Iris, you serve drinks. What's your take on multi-million-dollar shell companies? The table erupted in laughter. Mason Hernandez, a man who controlled half the city's concrete and concrete futures, was mocking the waitress. She balanced a tray of crystal glasses filled with expensive whiskey, not even looking at him, and said 6 words about his new investment that made the laughter instantly die. That deal will bankrupt your family. The clink of ice against crystal stopped. Mason's expression went from amused to lethal in the space of a heartbeat. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that preceded violence. What did you just say? Before we begin, hit the subscribe button, like this video, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, because you would never expect what happens at the end of this story. Now let's get back into the story. The murmur of hushed conversations and the soft clink of silverware against fine china was the soundtrack of Iris Clarke's carefully rebuilt life. At 32, her world had contracted to the elegant confines of the Lion's Den, an upscale restaurant that catered to the city's most dangerous elite. It was a place where legitimate businessmen sat 3 tables away from organized crime figures, where politicians brokered deals with people who could make problems disappear, where the prawns were $60 and asking the wrong question could cost you more than money. Iris was exceptional at her job. She was invisible, efficient, and never, ever drew attention to herself. Her anonymity was her shield, her protection against the past that had nearly destroyed her. She moved through the dining room like water, filling gaps, anticipating needs, her dark skin and crisp white uniform making her fade into the background of wealthy white patrons who rarely looked servers in the eye. Tonight, the corner booth, what the staff privately called the war room, was occupied by the most dangerous man Iris had ever served. Mason Hernandez. She knew him the way everyone in the city knew him. His face appeared in news articles about legitimate business ventures and urban development projects, but everyone understood what those words really meant. Hernandez Enterprises was an empire built on concrete, construction, and connections that extended into every dark corner of the city's power structure. He was dining with his inner circle, 3 hard-faced men whose expensive suits couldn't quite hide the violence in their eyes. Vincent, his underboss, who looked like a corporate lawyer but reportedly handled personnel issues with brutal efficiency. Ray, the numbers guy, whose mild appearance disguised a mind that could launder money through 7 countries before breakfast. And Tommy, the youngest, eager to prove himself, quick to laugh at every joke his boss made. "The Riverside acquisition is perfect," Mason announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never been truly challenged. "We sign next week. The shell company structure is clean, the financing is solid. We'll own that entire waterfront development through 3 separate entities. The feds won't be able to trace a single connection back to us." "Brilliant strategy, boss," Vincent said, raising his glass of Macallan 25. "Absorbing the properties through the Delaware LLC shields us completely. By the time anyone notices the pattern, we'll have flipped half the buildings for legitimate profit. Plus," Tommy added with a smirk, "I heard the Castellano family was sniffing around that deal but couldn't structure the financing right. They're probably furious we got there first." A cold knot tightened in Iris's stomach at the mention of that name. Castellano. She steadied her hand, which was holding a tray of their 3rd round of drinks. Whiskey, neat for Mason, scotch for Vincent, bourbon for Ray, vodka for Tommy. "Just breathe. You're not that person anymore. You're invisible. They can't see you." She approached the table with practiced grace, her expression professionally neutral. "Your drinks, gentlemen." She placed each glass with precision, careful not to make eye contact, careful not to exist as anything more than a function. Tommy, 3 drinks in and feeling bold, watched her work with the lazy attention of a predator who'd spotted something amusing. He looked at Mason, a juvenile idea sparking in his eyes. "You know, boss," Tommy said, his voice loud enough to carry to neighboring tables, "you're always talking about getting real-world perspectives. This woman," he gestured dismissively at Iris. "She's ground level. She sees everything that happens in this restaurant. Maybe she's got insights we're missing." Mason, amused by his lieutenant's audacity, played along. "What are you suggesting?" "Tommy? I'm suggesting you ask her." Tommy's grin widened. "Ask her what she thinks of the Riverside deal. I'm sure she has some fascinating perspective from, the service industry." Vincent and Ray chuckled, uncomfortable but unwilling to break the moment by defending a waitress against their boss's entertainment. Mason Hernandez, a man who'd ordered hits with less emotional investment than he ordered dinner, leaned back in his leather booth. He had the cruel, calculating look of someone who'd found a new way to demonstrate his power. The lion's den was his territory. Everyone here existed at his pleasure. A waitress was just another piece on his board, and right now he was bored. He glanced at her name tag. Iris. Iris froze, her empty tray pressed against her side. She'd been about to retreat to the safety of the kitchen. She just wanted to drop the drinks and disappear into the background where she belonged. "My associate has a point," Mason continued, his voice projecting across the immediate area. "We're about to finalize a complex, multi-million-dollar real estate transaction. But we've been operating in an echo chamber. Maybe we need a fresh perspective." The table erupted in sycophantic laughter, though Vincent shot Tommy a look that suggested he'd crossed a line. Iris turned slowly, her face maintaining that professional neutral mask she'd perfected over 3 years of serving people who treated her like furniture. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She'd worked so hard to stay invisible, to never give anyone a reason to look at her twice, to never let anyone see past the uniform to the woman who used to analyze billion-dollar portfolios. "So, Iris," Mason asked, the smirk pulling at his lips, making him look almost boyish despite the danger he represented. "You serve drinks. What's your take on multi-million-dollar shell company acquisitions?" Iris's eyes flickered from Mason's arrogant face to Tommy's idiotic grin, to the two older men who looked uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. She saw their $3,000 suits and their casual cruelty. She saw the documents spread across their table, contracts, legal agreements, financial projections, carelessly displayed because they assumed no one around them could possibly understand what they were reading. She saw the world she'd run from 3 years ago, after her last employer, a rival crime organization, had decided she knew too much and made her choose between disappearing or dying. She'd chosen disappearing. She'd buried her master's degree in financial forensics, buried her photographic memory and analytical genius, buried the woman who could spot accounting fraud from across a room. But Mason Hernandez had just made a mistake. He'd mocked her while standing next to documents that told a story he clearly hadn't read carefully enough. And Iris's genius mind, dormant but never dead, had already processed what she'd seen during the 30 seconds she'd spent placing their drinks. She'd seen the LLC structure, she'd seen the financing terms, she'd seen the names of the shell companies involved, and she'd recognized the pattern immediately, because she'd seen it before, 2 years ago, when the Castellano family had used the exact same structure to trap a smaller organization into a money laundering scheme that had destroyed them from the inside out. Iris looked at Mason Hernandez, this powerful, dangerous man who thought she was nothing, and made a choice. She could stay silent, stay invisible, stay safe. Or she could speak the truth that was about to cost him everything he'd built, and hope that being right would protect her better than being invisible ever had. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, but carried absolute certainty. "That deal will bankrupt your family." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. The laughter died instantly, cut off mid-breath. Vincent's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Ray's eyes went wide. Tommy's smirk froze, and then melted into confusion. And Mason Hernandez's expression transformed from amused mockery to something cold and deadly, the mask of civility dropping away to reveal the predator underneath. The lion's den suddenly felt very quiet, very dangerous, and Iris Clark realized she'd just done the one thing she'd sworn never to do again. She'd made herself visible, and now there was no going back. The lion's den didn't advertise, it didn't need to. Located in the financial district on the third floor of a building that looked unremarkable from the street, it catered to a clientele that found their way through word of mouth and carefully cultivated connections. The restaurant's name appeared on no directory, no website, no social media. You either knew about it or you didn't belong there. Iris Clark had been working at the Lion's Den for 3 years. Ever since the night she'd walked away from her previous life with nothing but the clothes on her back and the photographic memory she couldn't erase no matter how hard she tried. The restaurant manager, a former associate of people Iris preferred not to think about, had hired her with no questions asked, which meant he'd been told to hire her, which meant someone had arranged this position as either protection or surveillance. Iris had never figured out which, and after 3 years, she'd stopped trying. The restaurant itself was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were. Dark wood paneling absorbed sound, creating an atmosphere of hushed confidentiality. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light that made everyone look softer, more trustworthy than they actually were. White tablecloths and fresh flowers adorned every surface. The wine list included bottles that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The menu was prix-fixe, $300 per person, and reservations were impossible to get unless you were the kind of person who made other people disappear. Iris moved through this world like a ghost. At 32, she'd perfected the art of invisibility. She kept her natural hair pulled back in a tight, professional bun. Her uniform, crisp white shirt, black vest, black slacks, was always immaculate. Her face maintained a pleasant neutrality that never quite reached smile or frown. She was efficient, anticipating needs before guests vocalized them, clearing plates at precisely the right moment, refilling wine glasses with mathematical precision. She never spoke unless spoken to. She never made eye contact unless necessary. She never, ever let anyone see past the uniform to the woman underneath. Because the woman underneath was dangerous. Not physically, Iris had never thrown a punch in her life. But intellectually, she was a weapon that had once been wielded by people who understood exactly how valuable her particular skills were. Iris had earned her master's degree in financial forensics from Columbia at 24, graduating top of her class with a thesis on complex money laundering schemes that had caught the attention of both the FBI and several organizations that the FBI spent considerable resources investigating. She'd been recruited immediately, not by law enforcement, but by a consulting firm that served clients who needed financial structures that could withstand federal scrutiny. She'd told herself it was legitimate work. Gray area, maybe, but not criminal. She'd been naive, brilliant, and 24 years old. She hadn't understood that gray areas didn't exist in the world she'd entered. There was legal, and there was the appearance of legal, and she'd been building the ladder for people who operated entirely in the darkness. For 6 years, Iris had been extraordinary at her job. She had a photographic memory that could recall 1,000-page financial documents after a single reading. She could spot accounting irregularities that auditors missed. She could structure shell corporations and offshore holdings so elegantly that even forensic accountants couldn't trace the money flow. She'd made millions of dollars appear and disappear, had built financial fortresses for men who needed their wealth protected from both law enforcement and rival criminals. She'd worked for the Moretti family, a mid-level crime organization with aspirations of expansion. They'd treated her well, paid her obscenely, protected her, gave her an apartment and a car, and respect that came with being genuinely valuable. She'd been their secret weapon, the brilliant black woman with the advanced degree who could legitimize their empire on paper. until the day she'd figured out that her boss, Vincent Moretti, was embezzling from his own family. She'd seen the patterns in the numbers, had traced the offshore accounts, had understood in one terrible moment of clarity that Vincent was preparing to betray his brothers and blame the missing money on federal seizures. Iris had made the catastrophic mistake of telling him she knew. She'd thought her value would protect her. She'd thought he'd appreciate her discretion, her warning that his plan had holes that would eventually be discovered. Instead, he'd smiled at her with cold calculation and given her a choice: disappear completely, or be disappeared permanently. She had 24 hours to decide. Iris had chosen life. She'd walked away from her apartment, her car, her bank accounts, everything that could be traced. She'd burned every bridge, every credential, every connection to her previous existence. The manager at the Lion's Den had materialized with a job offer the next day, which confirmed that someone was watching, someone was managing her exile. She'd been invisible ever since. A waitress in an expensive restaurant, serving drinks to the same kind of men she used to advise, hearing conversations about financial structures and shell companies and money laundering while pretending she understood nothing more complicated than wine pairings. It was torture. Her mind, trained to analyze and calculate and solve complex financial puzzles, was being forced into dormancy. Every time she overheard a conversation about offshore accounts or corporate structures, her brain automatically started processing the information, mapping out the connections, identifying the vulnerabilities. But she forced herself to stop, to shut down, to remain blank. Because being brilliant had nearly gotten her killed. Anonymity was survival. The Lion's Den was full of people like the ones she'd fled. Every night, she served dinner to criminals who dressed like businessmen, who discussed territory and product distribution in the language of corporate strategy. She poured wine for men who ordered violence with the same casual authority they used to order appetizers. And every night, she went home to her studio apartment in a neighborhood where no one asked questions. And she tried not to think about the fact that her photographic memory wouldn't let her forget a single financial document she'd ever read, wouldn't let her stop seeing patterns in the numbers she overheard, wouldn't let her be as ordinary and unremarkable as survival required. She'd rebuilt a life from nothing. It wasn't much. Studio apartment, waitress salary, no friends, no connections, no past, and no future. But it was safe. It was quiet. It was invisible. Until tonight, when Mason Hernandez had asked her a question that forced her to choose between continued invisibility and speaking a truth that could save his empire or end her life. 3 years of careful anonymity, about to shatter because a mafia boss thought mocking a waitress would entertain his lieutenants. Iris had learned the hard way that the universe had a cruel sense of humor. And Mason Hernandez was about to learn that some prey was never actually prey at all. Mason Hernandez had built his empire on two principles: appear legitimate and never leave evidence. At 47, he'd perfected both. Hernandez Enterprises owned construction companies, real estate holdings, and development projects across 3 states. On paper, he was a self-made businessman who'd parlayed a small concrete company into a multi-million-dollar operation. The business journals profiled him as a success story. City officials posed with him at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. What the profiles didn't mention was that Mason's concrete business had flourished by securing government contracts through bribes and intimidation, that his real estate holdings were purchased with money laundered through a network of shell companies spanning 7 countries, that his development projects served as perfect vehicles for moving illegal cash into legitimate assets. Mason had inherited a street-level operation from his father and transformed it into something that looked respectable from every angle. He wore $5,000 suits, donated to political campaigns, sat on charity boards. He'd legitimized his family's criminal enterprise by building an empire so complex that even federal prosecutors couldn't find a thread to pull that wouldn't unravel their entire case. Tonight, surrounded by his inner circle at the Lion's Den, Mason was finalizing the deal that would cement his legacy. The Riverside Waterfront Development, 60 acres of prime real estate that would be transformed into luxury condos, retail spaces, and a boutique hotel. Total project value, $200 million. Total money laundering capacity, incalculable. Vincent Caruso sat to Mason's right, his underboss and most trusted advisor. At 52, Vincent looked like a corporate attorney. Silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, expensive suit that fit perfectly. He'd earned an MBA from Wharton before joining Mason's operation 20 years ago. Vincent understood that modern organized crime wasn't about violence and intimidation. It was about spreadsheets and shell corporations and making sure the numbers told whatever story you needed them to tell. The structure is elegant, Vincent said, spreading documents across the table with the confidence of someone presenting to a board of directors. 3 separate LLCs registered in Delaware, each one purchasing parcels through what appears to be independent transactions. The financing flows through offshore accounts in the Caymans, gets cleaned through our consulting firm, then emerges as legitimate investment capital. Ray Martinez, their financial architect, leaned forward. Ray was younger, 42, nervous energy, always running calculations in his head. He'd worked for legitimate investment banks before Mason had recruited him with a salary that reflected his actual value rather than his official credentials. The beauty of the Riverside deal, Ray explained, his fingers tracing connections between documents, is that we're using the Castellano family's own failed bid against them. They tried to structure this exact purchase 18 months ago but couldn't get the financing together. Their paperwork is still floating around in city records. We've essentially copied their homework, improved it, and beaten them to the punch. Tommy Esposito, the youngest of Mason's lieutenants at 34, grinned at the mention of their rivals. Tommy handled enforcement, the violent side of the business that Mason preferred to keep at arm's length, but understood was necessary. He was eager, ambitious, and constantly trying to prove he belonged at this table. I heard Castellano was furious when we got the preliminary approval, Tommy said. Word is he's scrambling to find a way to block the deal, but it's too late. We've already secured the financing commitments and the city council votes. Mason sipped his whiskey, enjoying the moment. The Riverside deal represented everything he'd worked toward, a massive, legitimate-looking project that would generate real profit while simultaneously cleaning tens of millions in dirty money. The shell company structure was airtight. The financing appeared to come from legitimate investment sources. The city officials who'd approved the preliminary permits had been carefully selected and appropriately motivated. The key vulnerability, Vincent said, always the strategist, is the connection between the 3 LLCs. If anyone starts looking closely at the ownership structures, they might see patterns. But we've layered it so deeply that even forensic accountants would need months to trace the connections, and by then, the project will be operational and generating legitimate revenue. Plus, Ray added, we've built in multiple exit strategies. If federal attention gets too intense, we can liquidate the LLCs through prearranged buyers and walk away with clean money. The beauty of real estate is that it always has inherent value, even if the ownership gets complicated. Mason studied the documents spread before him, contracts, financial projections, architectural renderings of the Riverside development. It looked perfect. It felt perfect. 20 years of building his empire had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts said this deal was the crown jewel of his operation. We sign next Friday, Mason announced with finality. Vincent, make sure all the paperwork is ready. Ray, confirm the final financing transfers. Tommy, I want eyes on the Castellano operation. If they're planning any last-minute interference, I need to know 48 hours before the signing. His lieutenants nodded, already making notes, already executing his vision. This was why Mason had succeeded where others failed. He surrounded himself with competent people, people who understood that modern crime was a business that required the same strategic planning as any legitimate enterprise. The difference was that legitimate businesses operated within legal boundaries. Mason operated in the spaces between laws, in the gray areas where money flowed through enough jurisdictions that tracing it became practically impossible. The Riverside deal was perfect because it looked legitimate from every angle. City officials would celebrate the development project. Business journals would praise his vision. Federal agents might investigate, but they'd find nothing that couldn't be explained by complex but legal financial structures. Mason had spent 2 decades building a reputation as a legitimate businessman while running a criminal empire. The Riverside deal would prove that he'd succeeded, that he'd created something that could withstand any scrutiny, that could survive him and pass to the next generation as a genuine business rather than a criminal operation. What Mason didn't know, as he celebrated with his inner circle over expensive whiskey and complicated spreadsheets, was that the deal he thought was perfect was actually a trap. A sophisticated, multi-layered financial trap designed by the Castellano family to destroy him from the inside out. And the only person in the lion's den who could see the trap clearly was the black waitress in the white uniform, standing 10 feet away with a tray of drinks, whose photographic memory had already identified every red flag in the documents she'd glimpsed while serving their table. Iris Clark had recognized the pattern because she'd seen it before. She'd helped build a similar structure 2 years ago, back when she worked for the Moretti family, back when they'd used the exact same technique to trap a rival organization into a money laundering scheme that had destroyed them. The Riverside deal wasn't Mason's crown jewel, it was the Castellano family's revenge. And in 30 seconds, when Tommy made his cruel joke and Mason asked for her opinion, Iris would have to decide whether staying invisible was worth watching a man walk into financial annihilation. Some choices, she was learning, weren't really choices at all. Iris approached the table with her third round of drinks balanced on a silver tray. Whiskey neat for Mason, scotch for Vincent, bourbon for Ray, vodka for Tommy. She'd memorized their preferences after the first round, the way she memorized everything whether she wanted to or not. Her photographic memory didn't discriminate between important information and trivial details. Everything got stored, cataloged, permanently filed. She'd also memorized the documents spread across their table during her previous approaches: the LLC formation papers, the financing agreements, the property transfer documents. Her mind had automatically started analyzing the structures, identifying the connections, mapping the money flow, before she'd forcibly shut down that part of her brain and reminded herself that she was a waitress, not a financial analyst, and survival depended on maintaining that fiction. "Your drinks, gentlemen," Iris said, her voice professionally neutral as she placed each glass with practiced precision. She never looked directly at their faces, never made eye contact unless absolutely necessary. Eye contact implied personhood, implied she existed as something more than a function. Invisibility was easier when you treated yourself like furniture. She was turning to leave, already planning her route to the kitchen, when Tommy's voice stopped her. "You know, boss," Tommy said, his words slightly slurred from the previous rounds. "You're always talking about getting perspectives from street level, real-world intel from people who see things we miss." Iris felt her stomach tighten. She knew where this was going. She'd worked in upscale restaurants long enough to recognize the particular tone that preceded humiliation. Rich men, powerful men, got bored easily. And when they got bored, they entertained themselves by reminding everyone else of their place in the hierarchy. "That's true," Mason said, amusement coloring his voice. "Ground-level intelligence has value. The people we usually don't notice often see things we miss." "Exactly." Tommy leaned forward, warming to his idea. "Like this woman." He gestured at Iris, without bothering to learn her name. "She works here every night. She serves all the major players, hears all the conversations. She's probably got insights into how this city really works." Vincent shot Tommy a look that suggested this was inappropriate, even by their standards. But Tommy either didn't notice or didn't care. He'd had too much vodka and not enough good sense to recognize that his boss's amusement could turn to annoyance if pushed too far. "What are you suggesting, Tommy?" Mason asked, his tone curious but edged with something darker. He was enjoying this, but he also needed Tommy to understand there was a point where entertainment became disrespect. "I'm suggesting," Tommy said, his grin widening, "that you ask her opinion about the Riverside deal. I bet she's got some fascinating perspective from the service industry. Maybe she can tell us if our shell company structure is sound based on, I don't know, how generous we tip." Ray looked uncomfortable, studying his bourbon like it contained answers. Vincent's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. No one directly contradicted Mason's entertainment, even when it crossed lines. Mason Hernandez studied his youngest lieutenant for a moment, calculating whether Tommy's suggestion was boldness or insubordination. Then he decided it was harmless fun, a way to break the tension of the complex deal they'd been analyzing all evening. What harm could come from asking a waitress for her opinion on a multi-million-dollar transaction? It was absurd, which made it amusing. He leaned back in the leather booth, whiskey in hand, his posture radiating the casual power of someone who controlled everything in his immediate environment. The lion's den was his territory. These men were his soldiers. This waitress was just another piece of the world he commanded. Mason glanced at her name tag. Iris. A pretty name for someone whose role was to be invisible. "My associate makes an interesting point," Mason said, projecting his voice just loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. He wanted an audience for this moment. "We've been analyzing this deal in our echo chamber. Maybe we do need a fresh perspective." Iris stood frozen, her empty tray pressed against her side, her back still half turned toward the table. Every instinct screamed at her to mumble something deferential and disappear into the kitchen. She was good at disappearing. She'd made a profession of it. "We're about to finalize a complex real estate acquisition," Mason continued, his tone conversational, but carrying the edge of someone who knew exactly how much power he wielded. Multiple LLCs, offshore financing, intricate ownership structures. The kind of deal that requires sophisticated financial analysis. Tommy laughed, already celebrating his cleverness. Vincent sighed quietly. Ray took another drink, uncomfortable witnessing humiliation, but unwilling to intervene. "So, Iris," Mason said, the name sounding almost like mockery in his mouth. "You serve drinks to people who make these kinds of decisions every night. You must have picked up something about how high-level finance works." He paused, letting the absurdity of the question build, letting everyone in the immediate vicinity tune in to watch the waitress squirm. "Tell me," Mason's smile was cruel in its casualness, "what's your professional opinion on multi-million-dollar shell company acquisitions? Any insights from your vast experience in the service industry?" The table erupted in sycophantic laughter. Tommy was practically doubled over. Even Vincent, despite his earlier discomfort, allowed himself a small smile. It was funny because it was absurd. Because asking a waitress for financial advice was like asking a child to perform surgery. The gulf between her world and theirs was so vast that the question itself was the joke. Iris turned slowly, her face maintaining that professional mask she'd perfected. Neutral, pleasant, blank. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought Mason might be able to see it through her uniform. Her hands wanted to shake, but she forced them still through sheer will. This was the moment she'd spent 3 years avoiding. The moment when remaining invisible required complicity in her own humiliation. She could laugh it off, play along, mumble something self-deprecating, and retreat to the safety of the kitchen. That would be the smart choice. The safe choice. But her eyes had already seen the documents on their table. Her photographic memory had already processed the LLC structures, the financing terms, the ownership chains, and her genius mind, dormant for 3 years but never dead, had recognized the pattern she'd seen before, the sophisticated financial trap that the Moretti family had used to destroy their rivals. Mason Hernandez was walking into a disaster that would bankrupt him, expose his operation to federal prosecution, and destroy everything he'd built. And he thought asking her opinion was a joke. Iris looked at Mason's arrogant face, at Tommy's idiotic grin, at Vincent's uncomfortable silence, at the documents that spelled out a trap these intelligent men hadn't recognized. She thought about 3 years of invisibility, 3 years of forcing her brilliant mind into dormancy, 3 years of serving drinks to criminals while pretending she didn't understand the conversations happening around her. And she made a choice that would either save her or kill her. She spoke. For 3 seconds, Iris felt the hot flush of humiliation wash over her. The laughter from Mason's table, the eyes of other diners turning to watch, the casual cruelty of powerful men entertaining themselves at her expense, it hit like a physical blow. She was being mocked for being a waitress, for existing in their world without belonging to it, for having the audacity to occupy space near their important conversation. Part of her wanted to say nothing, to laugh along self-deprecatingly, to play the role they'd assigned her and retreat to the kitchen where she belonged. That was the safe response. That was how you survived when powerful people decided you were their entertainment. But then her mind did what it always did when confronted with financial information. It started calculating whether she wanted it to or not. The documents on Mason's table weren't fully visible, but she'd seen enough during her 3 approaches. Her photographic memory didn't need complete information to start recognizing patterns. It was like her brain was a puzzle-solving machine that couldn't be turned off, that kept running in the background even when she tried to force it into dormancy. The first document she'd glimpsed during her initial approach, LLC formation papers for Riverside Development Holdings, registered in Delaware. Standard enough. Delaware was the go-to state for shell companies because of favorable corporate laws and privacy protections. The second document, partially visible under the first, financing agreement with Meridian Capital Partners, showing a $50 million line of credit with interest rates that seemed reasonable, 6.5% variable, tied to LIBOR, plus 200 basis points. The third document, the one she'd seen most clearly when placing their drinks this round. Transfer agreement for 3 separate property parcels, each purchased by a different LLC, Riverside Development Holdings, Coastal Investment Group, and Harbor Properties International. Individually, none of these documents triggered alarm. They were exactly what you'd expect to see in a complex real estate acquisition designed to obscure ownership patterns. Mason and his team were clearly competent at structuring deals that looked legitimate. But Iris's mind wasn't analyzing the documents individually. Her genius operated by seeing connections, by processing multiple data points simultaneously, and recognizing patterns that others missed. And as the 3 seconds of humiliation stretched into 4, her brain completed an analysis that made her blood run cold. The financing terms weren't reasonable. They were too reasonable. A $50 million line of credit at 6.5% for shell companies with no operational history and ownership structures deliberately designed to be opaque? Real lenders would charge 10 to 12% minimum for that kind of risk, unless the lender wasn't actually a lender. Unless Meridian Capital Partners was itself a shell company designed to look like legitimate financing. The 3 LLC names, Riverside, Coastal, Harbor, followed a pattern. Maritime theme, geographic connection, designed to appear related but independent. She'd seen that exact naming pattern before, 2 years ago, in documents she'd reviewed for the Moretti family. The Castellano organization had used similarly themed shell companies to trap a rival into a money laundering scheme. And then there was the detail that clinched it, the tiny flag that her memory had caught on the transfer agreement, the law firm handling the documentation. Brennan and Associates, listed at the bottom of the contract in small print. She knew that firm. She'd researched them years ago when analyzing competitive operations. Brennan and Associates was the legal front for the Castellano family, used exclusively for their complex financial structures. Mason Hernandez thought he was purchasing property through legitimate channels. What he was actually doing was signing agreements drafted by his rival's lawyers, accepting financing from his rival's shell company, and structuring ownership through LLCs that would be revealed, at exactly the right moment, to be controlled by Castellano interests. It was brilliant and vicious. Mason would pour millions into the Riverside development, believing he controlled it. Then, at some critical juncture, probably after he'd invested heavily in construction and improvements, the Castellano family would reveal the true ownership structure. They'd prove in court that Mason had been purchasing property he didn't actually own, that his financing was fraudulent, that his entire development was built on forged transfer agreements. The federal authorities would investigate. They'd find evidence of money laundering that Mason had unwittingly created by moving his dirty money into a trap designed to document every illegal transaction. His legitimate business empire would collapse under federal scrutiny. His assets would be seized. His organization would be destroyed from the inside out. And the Castellano family, having masterfully orchestrated the entire scheme through layers of legal documentation, would acquire the Riverside development for pennies on the dollar, while their rival rotted in federal prison. Iris's mind processed all of this in the space between heartbeats. Pattern recognition, financial forensics, money laundering mechanics, all the skills she'd spent 3 years suppressing surged to the surface with perfect clarity. She saw the trap the way you might see a bear trap hidden under leaves once someone pointed it out. Obvious, deadly, already sprung. Mason Hernandez had been set up with surgical precision by people who understood exactly how smart he was and had structured a trap that exploited his confidence rather than his stupidity. They'd made the deal look sophisticated enough to appeal to his ego, complex enough to obscure the deception, and legitimate enough to bypass his instincts. And he was 5 days away from signing his empire's death warrant. The laughter at the table was dying down. Tommy was wiping tears from his eyes. Vincent was checking his phone, already moving past the moment. Ray was signaling for another bourbon, uncomfortable but complicit. Mason was waiting for her response, that cruel smile still playing at his lips, expecting her to stammer something self-deprecating or simply flee to the kitchen in embarrassed silence. Iris looked at him, this powerful, dangerous man who'd mocked her for sport, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger, not vindication, just a cold, clear certainty about what she was about to do and what it would cost her. She could stay silent. She could protect her anonymity, her safety, her carefully rebuilt life. She could let Mason walk into the trap because it wasn't her problem, wasn't her business, wasn't worth exposing herself. Or she could speak 6 words that would save his empire and destroy her invisibility forever. 3 years ago, Iris had chosen survival over truth. She'd walked away from her previous life rather than risk exposure. But standing in the lion's den with her empty tray pressed against her uniform, watching a man about to lose everything to a trap she could see clearly, Iris realized that some truths demanded to be spoken regardless of the cost. Her voice, when she finally responded, was quiet but carried absolute certainty. That deal will bankrupt your family. The words left Iris's mouth with the finality of a judge reading a sentence. Not loud, not dramatic, just 6 words spoken with absolute certainty by a woman in a waitress uniform holding an empty silver tray. That deal will bankrupt your family. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Tommy's laughter cut off mid-breath like someone had flipped a switch. His mouth hung open, confusion replacing amusement. Ray's bourbon glass stopped halfway to his lips, frozen in space. Vincent's eyes snapped up from his phone, suddenly alert in the way of someone who'd just heard a fire alarm, and Mason Hernandez, who had been leaning back in casual amusement, went absolutely still. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a predator realizing something unexpected had just happened. The silence before violence. The silence of power calculating whether it had just been challenged or threatened, or insulted beyond tolerance. Iris felt every eye in the immediate vicinity lock onto her. Neighboring tables had stopped their conversations, sensing the shift in atmosphere. A waiter carrying a tray of entrees slowed his approach, instinctively avoiding the suddenly dangerous space around Mason's table. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to dim, as if the lion's den itself was holding its breath. Mason's expression transformed slowly, degree by degree, from amused mockery to something far more dangerous. The casual smile melted away. His eyes, which had been playful and cruel, became focused and cold. His body language shifted from relaxed entertainment to coiled threat. This was the man who ordered violence with the same ease he ordered dinner, the man who'd built an empire on knowing when someone was lying to him, the man who couldn't afford to show weakness or uncertainty in front of his lieutenants. "What?" Mason said quietly, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "Did you just say?" Iris's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, in her temples. Every survival instinct screamed at her to backtrack, to laugh it off as a joke, to apologize and disappear. She'd just insulted a mafia boss in front of his inner circle. She'd embarrassed him publicly. She'd crossed a line that people didn't cross if they wanted to keep breathing. But she'd already spoken. The words couldn't be taken back, and more importantly, they were true. She'd seen the trap clearly, had recognized the pattern that would destroy everything Mason had built. Backing down now wouldn't save her. It would just make her look like she'd been speaking randomly, saying something shocking for attention. The only way forward was through. "I said," Iris repeated, her voice steady despite the terror flooding her system, "that deal will bankrupt your family." Tommy looked at Mason, uncertain how to react. Was this funny? Was this disrespectful? Should he laugh or should he be angry on his boss's behalf? Vincent had gone very still, his strategic mind already processing implications. Ray looked like he wanted to sink through the floor and disappear. Mason leaned forward slowly, his eyes never leaving Iris's face. He was searching for something, signs of mental illness, evidence of a prank, any explanation for why a waitress would say something so specific, so devastating, so impossible for her to know. "You're a waitress," Mason said, each word carefully measured. "You serve drinks, you clear plates. How would you possibly know anything about my business deals?" It was a fair question. It was the question. Because what Iris was about to do would either save her life or guarantee her death. There was no middle ground when you told a mafia boss his empire was in danger. You were either valuable enough to protect or dangerous enough to eliminate. "I know," Iris said quietly, "because I can see your documents from here. And I've seen this exact structure before. You're being set up by the Castellano family." The silence that followed was even more profound than before. Iris had just confirmed that she could read complex financial documents from across the table, that she understood sophisticated money laundering structures, and that she knew the names of rival crime families. She'd revealed herself as something other than a waitress in 3 sentences. Vincent's hand moved slightly toward his jacket, instinct, checking for the weapon Iris knew he carried. Tommy's confusion shifted to alertness, suddenly understanding that something serious was happening. Ray's face had gone pale, recognizing financial terminology that no server should know. But it was Mason's reaction that mattered most. His expression didn't soften exactly, but it changed. The cold fury was still there, but something else entered his eyes: calculation, curiosity, and the first hint of concern. "Explain," Mason said, the single word carrying the weight of a command that couldn't be refused. "Quickly, precisely. And if you're wasting my time, if this is some kind of joke or play for attention, you'll regret speaking at all." Iris understood the threat was real. She also understood that Mason's willingness to listen, even for 30 seconds, meant she had a chance. He was smart enough to recognize that her specificity, mentioning the Castellano family by name, referencing the structure rather than making vague accusations, suggested she might actually know something. The financing, Iris said, her voice gaining strength as her genius took over from her fear. Meridian Capital Partners, 50 million at 6.5% variable. That rate is too good for shell companies with no operational history. Because Meridian isn't a real lender, it's a Castellano front. Mason's eyes narrowed. He glanced at the documents on his table, then back at Iris. Continue. Your three LLCs, Iris continued, the words flowing now as her analytical mind engaged fully. Riverside Development Holdings, Coastal Investment Group, Harbor Properties International, Maritime Theme, Geographic Connection. The Castellano organization used that exact naming pattern in 2021 to trap the Moretti operation into a fraudulent property scheme. She caught herself almost revealing too much. I read about it in the news. That was a lie, and probably a transparent one, but it gave her cover. Mason didn't seem to care about the inconsistency. He was focused on the substance of what she was saying. And the law firm, Iris said, delivering the final piece. Brennan and Associates. They're listed at the bottom of your transfer agreements. That firm works exclusively for Castellano interests. They don't take outside clients. If they're handling your documentation, it means those contracts were drafted by your rival, not for you. The table sat in absolute silence. Iris could see the calculations happening behind Mason's eyes, the strategic mind that had built an empire now processing new information, cross-referencing what she'd said against what he knew, looking for holes in her logic or confirmation of his own buried doubts. Finally, Mason turned to Vincent. His voice was still cold, still dangerous, but directed elsewhere now. Call our legal team. I want Brennan and Associates verified. And get me everything on Meridian Capital, right now. Vincent was already pulling out his phone, moving away from the table for privacy. Ray looked between Mason and Iris, his face a mask of shock. Tommy just stared, completely out of his depth. Mason looked back at Iris, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't expected to see. A grudging respect mixed with suspicion and calculation. Who? Mason asked quietly. Are you really? Iris had 3 seconds to decide how much truth to reveal before Mason decided she was dangerous enough to eliminate. The question hung in the air, who are you really? And every answer carried lethal consequences. Too much truth would expose her past with the Moretti family, mark her as a liability. Too little would make her look like she was lying or guessing, which would insult Mason's intelligence and waste his time. She chose the narrow path between disclosure and survival. My name is Iris Clark, she said, her voice steady. I have a master's degree in financial forensics from Columbia. I specialized in complex money laundering detection and offshore asset structures. I worked as a consultant for 6 years before She paused, choosing words carefully. Before I needed to step away from that work. Mason's eyes narrowed. You're telling me a Columbia-educated financial analyst is working as a waitress at the Lion's Den. Why? Because sometimes staying alive means staying invisible, Iris said quietly. You understand that better than most. The truth of that statement registered on Mason's face. He did understand. His entire empire was built on legitimate appearance and invisible reality. He couldn't judge her for choosing survival over career. Show me, Mason said abruptly, gesturing to the documents on his table. Walk me through exactly what you see. And if you're wrong, or if you're wasting my time, this conversation ends very badly for you. Iris glanced around the Lion's Den. Other diners were still watching, curious about the tension at Mason's table. The restaurant manager had noticed the commotion and was moving toward them, concern etched on his face. Not here, Vincent said, returning from his phone call. His expression was grim. Boss, you need to hear what I just learned, but not in public. Mason studied Iris for a long moment, calculation evident in every line of his face. Then he stood, pulling a money clip from his pocket and dropping several $100 bills on the table. "Private dining room," he said to Vincent. Then to Iris. "You're coming with us. Bring those documents." It wasn't a request. Iris felt ice slide down her spine as she realized she was about to be alone in a private room with a mafia boss and his enforcers, explaining how she knew things that could destroy or save his empire. This was exactly the situation she'd spent 3 years avoiding. But she'd already committed. She set down her tray, gathered the contracts and agreements from Mason's table, and followed them through the restaurant toward the private rooms reserved for VIP clients. The manager tried to intercept them. "Mr. Hernandez, is there a problem? Is Iris—" "She's fine," Mason said without breaking stride. "We're having a business discussion. Make sure we're not disturbed." The private room was elegant. Leather chairs around a polished conference table, soundproof walls, no windows. The door closed with a heavy finality that made Iris's survival instincts scream. Tommy locked it from the inside. Mason gestured to the documents Iris was holding. "Spread them out. Explain." Iris laid the contracts across the table, her hands steadier than she'd expected. 3 years of dormancy fell away as her analytical mind engaged fully. She was back in her element, reading financial structures the way poets read verse. "The Riverside acquisition is structured as 3 separate purchases through independent LLCs," Iris began, her voice shifting into the precise terminology of her former profession. "Standard practice for obscuring beneficial ownership. But look at the financing structure." She pointed to the Meridian Capital Agreement. 50 million line of credit at 6.5% variable, LIBOR plus 200 basis points. That's below market rate for shell companies with no operational history and deliberately opaque ownership structures. Legitimate lenders price risk appropriately. They'd charge 10 to 12% minimum, probably closer to 15% for this risk profile. Ray leaned forward, suddenly engaged. As the financial architect, he understood what she was saying. "Unless the favorable terms are part of the value proposition, if Meridian wanted our business badly enough—" "Meridian doesn't want your business," Iris interrupted. "Meridian wants your exposure. Because when you sign these agreements, you're not just borrowing money. You're creating documentation that proves you're moving illicit funds through a controlled financing mechanism. Every dollar you invest becomes evidence." Mason's expression darkened. "Evidence of what?" "Money laundering," Iris said flatly. "Meridian Capital Partners isn't a real lender. It's a documentary trap. The Castellano family will let you invest millions into Riverside. They'll let you improve the properties, start construction, commit resources. Then, at the optimal moment, probably right before you're about to flip the properties for legitimate profit, they'll reveal the true ownership structure." She pulled the transfer agreements forward. "These contracts transfer property from entities that don't actually own it. The chain of title is deliberately corrupted. Brennan and Associates drafted these documents knowing they contain false representations. When it unravels, you'll have documented proof that you attempted to purchase property through fraudulent transfers while moving illicit funds through a fake lending institution." "That brings the feds," Vincent said quietly, understanding dawning. "Not just for the Riverside deal. They'll investigate the entire financing structure, trace every dollar back through our operation." "Exactly," Iris confirmed. "The Castellano family isn't trying to steal your money. They're trying to build a federal case against you, using your own investments as evidence. You'll do the work of documenting your own criminal enterprise. They'll probably even cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for immunity, claiming they were investigating your organization and gathered this evidence." Mason's hands were clenched into fists on the table. "And the properties? They'll seize them as proceeds of criminal activity. Castellano will acquire them at government auction for pennies on the dollar. They destroy your operation, eliminate a rival, and get the Riverside development essentially for free." The room fell silent as the full implications settled over everyone. Tommy looked sick. Ray was rapidly reviewing documents, checking the details Iris had cited. Vincent's expression was thunderous. "The law firm, Mason said. You mentioned Brennan and Associates works exclusively for Castellano. How do you know that? This was the dangerous question. The one that required Iris to reveal just enough to establish credibility without exposing her entire past. Because 6 years ago, Iris said carefully, I worked for a consulting firm that analyzed competitive organized crime financial structures. We studied Castellano operations extensively. Brennan and Associates appeared in every complex deal they structured. They're not listed publicly as counsel of record for Castellano interests, but the pattern is unmistakable. Same firm, same structure type, same shell company tactics. It was truth wrapped in vagueness, accurate without being complete. Mason studied her face, looking for deception. Vincent's phone buzzed. He checked it, his expression confirming bad news. Boss, our legal team just verified. Brennan and Associates has represented Castellano-connected entities in at least 7 deals over the past 5 years. And Meridian Capital Partners was incorporated 8 months ago, right around the time we started exploring the Riverside acquisition. Mason's jaw tightened. He looked at the documents spread across the table, at the deal that would have destroyed everything he'd built, then at the black woman in a waitress uniform who'd just saved his empire from annihilation. How much time before we were supposed to sign? He asked Vincent. 5 days. Next Friday, 2 p.m. Mason turned back to Iris. His expression was complex, anger at being nearly fooled, grudging respect for her analysis, and calculation about what to do with someone who clearly knew far too much about how his world operated. You just saved me from federal prison, Mason said quietly. That's worth something. The question is, what do I do with you now? Mason Hernandez didn't build an empire by hesitating. Once he understood a threat, he acted with the decisiveness that had kept him alive and powerful for 25 years. He pulled out his phone and made 3 calls in rapid succession, each one delivered with the absolute authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. The first call was to his attorney, his real attorney, not the Castellano compromised firm that had nearly destroyed him. Michael, it's Mason. I need you to kill the Riverside deal immediately, full stop. I don't care about the deposits or preliminary agreements. Find whatever legal mechanism exists to void everything. Breach of contract, discovery of material misrepresentation, force majeure. I don't care what you call it. Just make it dead by morning. He listened briefly to the response, then cut it off. I'll explain later. Right now, I need that deal terminated in writing before sunrise. And Michael, we're going to need to discuss how Brennan and Associates got anywhere near my business without you vetting them. The second call was shorter, more ominous. Carlo, I need a message delivered to our friends in the Castellano organization. They just tried to set me up using fraudulent financing and corrupted property transfers. I have documentation. I have proof. And I want them to know that I know. Make it clear, very clear, that any attempt to move forward with this scheme or retaliate for its exposure will be met with consequences they won't survive. Understood? Mason's voice had dropped to that dangerous quiet that meant violence was being authorized. Iris watched his face harden into something cold and calculating, seeing the man who'd risen to power by being more ruthless than his competitors. The third call was to his underboss's brother, a federal prosecutor who owed the Hernandez family several expensive favors. James, this is Mason Hernandez. I need to report a sophisticated fraud scheme. The Castellano organization has created a shell financing company called Meridian Capital Partners and is using it to trap competitors into documented money laundering schemes. I have contracts, I have proof of false representations, and I'm willing to cooperate fully with any investigation. Iris's eyes widened. Mason was doing something brilliant and ruthless. He was turning the trap back on its creators. By reporting the fraudulent scheme to federal authorities first, he was positioning himself as a victim of criminal fraud rather than a money launderer. The feds would investigate Meridian Capital and Brennan and Associates, And whatever they found would hurt the Castellano family far more than it hurt Mason's legitimate business operations. Mason ended the call and looked at Vincent. Pull every file we have on the Castellano organization: financial structures, known associates, property holdings, shell companies. I want a complete analysis of their operation on my desk by tomorrow afternoon. Vincent nodded, already making notes. You want us to go offensive? I want us to be prepared, Mason corrected. They tried to destroy us using financial warfare. We're going to make sure they understand that was a catastrophic mistake, but we do this smart, documented, through channels that won't expose us to federal scrutiny. He turned to Ray. Review every deal we've closed in the past 18 months. Check every law firm, every financing source, every shell company involved. If the Castellano family compromised the Riverside deal, they might have touched other transactions. I want to know the full extent of our exposure. Ray was already gathering documents. I'll have a preliminary report by morning. Mason looked at Tommy, who'd been silent throughout the entire exchange. You still think asking waitresses for financial advice is funny? Tommy's face had gone pale. No, boss, I'm sorry. You were drunk and stupid, Mason interrupted. But you accidentally did something useful. Your joke saved this organization from destruction. Remember that the next time you think humiliation is entertainment. Tommy nodded, chastened and clearly understanding how close they'd all come to disaster. Mason turned his full attention to Iris, who'd been standing quietly, watching the rapid mobilization of his empire's resources. His expression was complex, gratitude mixed with suspicion, respect layered over calculation. You just prevented a catastrophe that would have destroyed everything I built, Mason said. That kind of intervention deserves compensation. More than that, it requires explanation. You don't accidentally know this much about organized crime financial structures. You don't casually recognize Castellano tactics. You don't work as a waitress with a Columbia degree unless you're hiding from something. Iris felt her carefully constructed invisibility dissolving completely. She'd known this moment would come the second she'd spoken those 6 words. You didn't save a Mafia boss's empire and walk away anonymous. I told you, Iris said carefully. I worked as a consultant. I analyzed these structures professionally, and then I needed to disappear because I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. Who did you work for? Mason asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who would find out eventually whether she answered or not. Iris calculated rapidly. She could lie, but Mason would investigate. He'd discover her connection to the Moretti family, and finding out she'd withheld that information would destroy whatever trust she'd just built. Or she could tell the truth and hope that saving his empire bought her enough goodwill to survive the revelation. The Moretti organization, Iris said quietly. I was their financial consultant for 6 years. I structured their money laundering operations, created their shell companies, designed their offshore holdings. Then I discovered internal fraud, reported it to the wrong person, and was given a choice between disappearing or dying. I chose to disappear. The room went very quiet. The Moretti family was known to Mason, a mid-level operation that had collapsed spectacularly 2 years ago amid internal betrayals and federal investigations. If Iris had been their financial architect, she knew things about organized crime that made her either extremely valuable or extremely dangerous. Mason studied her face for a long moment. Then he made a decision that would change both their lives. Vincent, add Iris Clark to the organization's consultant roster, retainer of $200,000 annually, plus project fees for any analysis work. Her employment begins immediately. Iris's breath caught. Mr. Hernandez, You don't have a choice, Mason said, but his tone wasn't threatening. You just proved you can see threats I miss. You spotted a sophisticated trap that my entire team overlooked. That kind of genius doesn't go back to serving drinks. You work for me now. You use that brilliant mind to protect my interests. And in exchange, I make sure no one from your past ever finds you. He leaned forward. You wanted to stay invisible. I'm offering you something better. Be visible under my protection. Use your skills legitimately. Get paid what you're actually worth. And help me make sure no one ever sets a trap like this again. Iris looked around the private room, at Vincent's calculating approval, at Ray's professional respect, at Tommy's chastened silence. She looked at the documents that proved she'd just saved an empire. She looked at Mason Hernandez, dangerous and powerful, offering her a way back into the world she'd fled. 3 years of invisibility, ended by 6 words of truth. Okay, Iris said quietly. I accept. After Vincent, Ray, and Tommy had left the private room with their assignments, Mason remained seated across from Iris. The aggressive decisiveness that had characterized his emergency response had faded, leaving something Iris hadn't expected to see in a man of his power: genuine humility. Do you understand what you just saved me from? Mason asked quietly. Not just the money, not just the business, my freedom, my legacy, everything. Iris nodded slowly. The federal prosecution would have been devastating. With documented money laundering evidence you'd created yourself, they would have seized every asset, frozen every account. RICO charges, probably 25 years minimum. Your entire organization dismantled. My family destroyed, Mason added. My children's inheritance gone. My name associated with stupidity rather than strategic brilliance. 25 years of building an empire ended because I was too arrogant to properly vet a deal that looked too good. He stood and walked to the window, though it showed only the private room's elegant walls. His posture carried the weight of someone processing how close he'd come to total ruin. I mocked you, Mason said. And Iris heard something she never expected: shame. I asked for your opinion as a joke, entertainment for my men. I saw a waitress and assumed ignorance. I saw a black woman in a service position and never considered she might be the most educated person in the room. You weren't alone in that, Iris said. Invisibility only works because people make assumptions. But those assumptions almost cost me everything. Mason turned back to face her. You could have stayed silent. You could have let me walk into that trap. God knows I gave you every reason to let me destroy myself. Iris considered lying, offering some noble reason for speaking up. But Mason had been honest with her, and she owed him the same courtesy. I almost did stay silent, she admitted. 3 years of survival training told me to keep my head down, serve the drinks, let powerful men make their own mistakes. But I couldn't watch someone walk into that specific trap, knowing exactly what it was, and say nothing. Not when speaking up might save them. Even though speaking up exposed you, Mason said, even though it destroyed your anonymity and forced you back into a world you'd fled, you chose truth over safety. I chose being able to live with myself, Iris corrected. There's a difference. Mason returned to his seat, studying her with an intensity that made Iris uncomfortable. The $200,000 retainer I mentioned, that's not compensation for tonight. That's just the baseline for having you available for consultation. What you did tonight, preventing a catastrophic trap that would have ended my empire, that requires something more substantial. He pulled out his phone and made a transfer that took less than 30 seconds. Iris's phone, still in her uniform pocket, buzzed with a notification. Check it, Mason said. Iris pulled out her phone with shaking hands. The notification was from her bank, an incoming wire transfer. The amount made her breath catch: $2.5 million. Mr. Hernandez, I can't. You can and you will, Mason interrupted firmly. That's not a gift. That's a debt payment. You saved my empire, my freedom, and my family's future. If I'd walked into the Castellano trap, I would have lost hundreds of millions before federal prosecution even started. $2.5 million is cheap for that kind of salvation. Iris stared at the number on her phone screen, struggling to process that her life had just changed fundamentally in the span of 2 hours. This morning she'd been a waitress making $15 an hour plus tips. Tonight she was a financial consultant with a 7-figure payment and a retainer that exceeded what she'd made in her entire previous career. "There's something else you need to understand," Mason said, his voice softer now. "I've built my reputation on being smarter than everyone around me, on seeing angles others miss, on never being fooled. Tonight, I was completely fooled. I was set up by my rivals and I didn't see it coming. My own team, educated and experienced, didn't see it. We would have walked right into federal prison if not for you." He paused, and Iris saw genuine emotion cross his face, a crack in the armor of power he usually wore. "That's humbling," Mason continued. "Discovering that my arrogance, my certainty that I'm always the smartest person in the room, almost destroyed everything. And discovering that the person who saved me was someone I was actively mocking, someone I'd dismissed as irrelevant." "You didn't know," Iris said. "I deliberately made sure you couldn't know." "That's generous," Mason said. "But it doesn't change the fact that I made assumptions based on your position and appearance rather than evidence of your capability. I'm supposed to be better than that. My survival has always depended on seeing value where others see nothing. Tonight I failed that test. You saved me from my own blindness." He stood, extending his hand across the table. "I owe you my empire, Iris Clark. That's not a debt I take lightly. From this point forward, you're under my protection. Anyone who threatens you answers to me. Anyone who underestimates you makes the same mistake I did. And I'm going to make sure my mistake serves as a lesson throughout my organization." Iris shook his hand, feeling the strength of his grip and the sincerity behind it. "I just want to use my skills legitimately, to prove that brilliance doesn't come in the package people expect." "You've already proven that," Mason said. "Tonight, you showed me that integrity and intelligence matter more than position or appearance. That wisdom can come from unexpected places. That the person serving drinks might be the most valuable person in the room." He released her hand, but held her gaze. "I've learned something tonight that I should have known all along. Never dismiss someone based on their circumstances. Never assume that education, intelligence, or capability correlate with job title or social position. And never, ever mock someone for being exactly where life forced them to be." "Those are good lessons," Iris said quietly. "They're expensive lessons," Mason corrected. "They almost cost me everything. But because of you, I get to learn them and keep my empire. That makes you the most valuable person I've ever met." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Take tomorrow off. Rest. Process what just happened. But Monday morning, I want you in my office. We're going to review every major deal, every financial structure, every partnership in my organization. And you're going to tell me what I'm missing, what I'm vulnerable to, and how to protect what I've built." "I can do that," Iris said. "I know you can," Mason said. "That's why you're not serving drinks anymore. That's why you're about to become one of the most protected and valued people in my entire operation, not despite who you are, but because of it." He opened the door, then looked back one final time. "Thank you, Iris, for your integrity, for your courage, and for reminding me that brilliance doesn't advertise itself. It reveals itself when it matters most." After he left, Iris stood alone in the private room, looking at the $2.5 million on her phone screen and trying to understand that her life of invisibility was truly over. She'd spoken 6 words that saved an empire, and in doing so, she'd saved herself. 6 months later, Iris Clark sat in a corner office on the 18th floor of Hernandez Enterprises, reviewing financial documents that would have terrified her former self. The view overlooked the city's financial district, glass and steel towers reflecting afternoon sunlight that once would have seemed impossibly distant from her Waitress existence. She'd stopped counting the ways her life had transformed. The luxury apartment in a secure building where doormen knew her by name. The wardrobe of professional suits that replaced her server's uniform. The bank account that had grown from $2.5 million to something considerably more substantial as project fees accumulated. But the most significant change wasn't visible in external markers of success. It was internal. The resurrection of a mind that had been forced into dormancy for 3 years. Iris was brilliant again, openly, professionally, unapologetically brilliant, and it felt like breathing after years underwater. Her official title was Strategic Financial Consultant, which was deliberately vague enough to avoid explaining what she actually did. In practice, she was Mason's secret weapon, the analyst who examined every major deal, every partnership, every financial structure for hidden traps and vulnerabilities. She'd already prevented 2 additional fraud attempts, restructured 3 money laundering operations to be more legally defensible, and saved the organization approximately $50 million in avoided losses. Mason had made good on every promise. The protection he'd offered was comprehensive and absolute. When Vincent Moretti had sent inquiries about Iris's current location, apparently her former employer had finally noticed her expertise working for a rival. Mason had shut it down with such finality that the Moretti family had gone silent on the matter entirely. The message was clear. Iris Clark was under Hernandez's protection, and anyone who threatened her would face consequences that transcended business rivalry. She was untouchable now, not because she was invisible, but because she was valuable. The office door opened and Mason entered without knocking, carrying 2 cups of coffee, an habit he'd developed over the past months. Despite his power and status, he'd started treating their working relationship with genuine respect rather than hierarchical distance. The Castellano situation is officially resolved, Mason said, setting 1 coffee on her desk. Federal prosecutors are moving forward with fraud charges against Meridian Capital Partners and Brennan and Associates. 3 Castellano associates have already taken plea deals. The entire organization is in chaos. Good, Iris said simply. The Castellano family had tried to destroy Mason. Watching their trap turn back on them carried a certain satisfaction. There's something else, Mason continued, settling into the chair across from her desk. I've been thinking about what you said 6 months ago, about wanting to use your skills legitimately, about proving that brilliance comes in unexpected packages. Iris looked up from her documents, curious where this was going. I want to start something new, Mason said. A consulting firm, completely legitimate, no organized crime connections, no money laundering structures. A firm that specializes in financial forensics and fraud detection. We'd serve actual businesses, help them identify vulnerabilities before criminals exploit them. Use your genius for something that doesn't require hiding. He leaned forward, enthusiasm evident in his voice. I'd fund it. You'd run it. We'd recruit other analysts like you, brilliant people who fell through the cracks or ended up in wrong situations. People whose intelligence got dismissed because of their backgrounds or circumstances. We'd build something that proves expertise doesn't come from pedigree, it comes from capability. Iris felt something tighten in her chest, hope mixed with caution. That's a beautiful idea, but you're talking about stepping away from your core business. Why? Because you taught me something, Mason said. That night at the Lion's Den, when you spoke up despite every reason to stay silent, you showed me that integrity has strategic value, that doing the right thing isn't weakness, it's the strongest choice you can make. I've spent 25 years building an empire in the shadows. Maybe it's time to build something in the light. That's a significant transformation, Iris said carefully. Are you sure? I'm 47 years old, Mason said. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. My children are asking questions about what their father actually does for a living. And I'm tired of looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next federal investigation or rival's trap. You gave me a second chance at building a legacy I can be proud of. I want to take it. Iris thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, invisible, terrified, forcing her genius into dormancy because brilliance had become dangerous. She thought about speaking 6 words that changed everything, about choosing truth over safety, about the resurrection of a mind that had been buried but never dead. Clark and Hernandez Financial Forensics, Iris said. My name goes first. Equal partnership. We recruit from unconventional backgrounds, people who got dismissed or pushed aside because they didn't fit traditional molds. We prove that brilliance is everywhere if you're willing to look for it. Mason smiled. Deal. Though I have one condition. What's that? We tell the story. Not the organized crime parts, but the core truth. That the founder was a waitress who saved her employer from a sophisticated fraud by speaking up when everyone told her to stay silent. That she proved expertise doesn't advertise itself with credentials and titles. That sometimes the most valuable person in the room is the one nobody's looking at. Iris considered the vulnerability of that exposure, the risk of making herself visible in yet another way. Then she thought about all the brilliant people still hiding, still serving drinks or cleaning offices, or working jobs beneath their capabilities, because the world had convinced them their intelligence didn't matter without the right pedigree. Okay, she said. We tell the story. We make visibility safer for people like us. Mason extended his hand across the desk. Partners? Iris shook it firmly. Partners. 3 months later, Clark and Hernandez Financial Forensics opened its doors in a downtown office building. The founding story, carefully edited to remove criminal elements, made headlines in business journals. A waitress who saved her employer from a sophisticated fraud scheme, now running a forensics firm that recruited unconventional talent and proved that expertise came from capability rather than credentials. Applications flooded in from people who'd been dismissed, overlooked, or pushed aside by traditional finance, former retail workers with photographic memories, taxi drivers who'd taught themselves complex mathematics, home health aides with coding genius, all the invisible brilliance that existed in the margins of society, finally being seen and valued. Iris interviewed each candidate personally, looking for the same quality Mason had recognized in her: intelligence that revealed itself when it mattered, integrity that chose truth over safety, and courage that spoke up despite the cost. 6 months after that, the firm secured its first major client, a Fortune 500 company that wanted comprehensive fraud analysis. Then another, then 10 more. Within a year, Clark and Hernandez was one of the most respected forensics firms in the industry, known for catching fraud that traditional auditors missed. And Iris Clark, who'd once served drinks while hiding her genius to survive, now ran a firm that proved brilliance didn't need permission to exist. It just needed someone willing to recognize it. She'd spoken 6 words that saved an empire. In doing so, she'd built one of her own, an empire of formerly invisible people whose intelligence finally had a home. The new ledger was written in daylight. And this time, Iris's brilliance wasn't a secret to be hidden. It was a force to be reckoned with. Hit the subscribe button now if you enjoyed this story, because you will surely love the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end, and see you in the next one.